In the shadows of America's frontier history lies a truth they didn't want you to know. When the most feared woman in the Arizona Territory faced certain death, her salvation came from the most unexpected hands. What happened next would challenge everything the West believed about courage, justice, and who deserves to be called a hero. That black man should have left her to die. A gunslinger like her, she's killed better men than him. Some say she deserved worse than drowning. But what happens when hatred meets honor on the banks of a merciless river? Stay with me until the end to discover how one man's decision to save a notorious outlaw changed the course of Western history forever. If this is your first time here, I share the untold stories of black heroes from America's past on the Black Rancher channel. Hit subscribe now and ring that bell so you never miss these powerful tales that history tried to erase. And if you already follow our journey, share this video to help others learn the truth about who really shaped the American frontier. Now let's dive into Chapter 1 of a story that will change how you see the West forever. Arizona Territory, August 1880. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on Solomon Reed's broad shoulders as he guided his stallion along the banks of the Gila River. At 35, Solomon had earned every line on his face and every gray strand in his close-cropped beard. 15 years of freedom since the war had taught him that even in the supposedly free territories, a black man riding alone had to keep his eyes sharp and his wits sharper. His ranch, the 7 Arrows, lay 3 miles south, a modest spread by some standards, but an impossibility back in Tennessee where he'd been born into bondage. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed his body, but it was this land that had truly freed his soul. 160 acres claimed through the Homestead Act, worked by his own hands, until the rocky soil finally yielded to his determination. Solomon dismounted to let his horse, Midnight, drink from the river when he heard it, barely audible above the rushing water. A muffled sound, something between a grunt and a gasp. He stiffened, hand instinctively moving to the worn Remington revolver on his hip. Out here, strange sounds rarely meant anything good. The sound came again, more desperate this time. Solomon followed the noise around a bend in the river, keeping to the shelter of cottonwood trees. What he saw froze him in his tracks. A woman was thrashing in the middle of the river, bound to a half-submerged log with thick rope. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, her sodden clothes clinging to a frame that was struggling with increasing weakness against her bonds. The current wasn't swift here, but it didn't need to be. Bound as she was, exhaustion and the weight of the water would finish her soon enough. Solomon hesitated for just a moment. In these parts, folks didn't get tied to logs and left in rivers by accident. Whoever she was, someone wanted her dead, someone who might not take kindly to interference. But as he watched her head dip below the surface, then rise with a desperate gasp, Solomon knew he couldn't stand by. Whatever she'd done, drowning tied to a log wasn't justice. It was cruelty. He shed his coat and gun belt in one fluid motion and plunged into the water. The woman's eyes widened as she saw him coming, blue eyes, startlingly bright against her mud-streaked face. For a moment, fear replaced exhaustion in her expression. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Solomon called as he reached her. "Gonna cut you loose." She didn't respond, just watched him warily as he pulled his knife from its sheath and began sawing at the ropes. Up close, he could see bruises forming on her face and a split in her lower lip. Whoever had done this hadn't been gentle about it. As the last rope fell away, the woman collapsed against him, too weak to stay upright. Solomon hoisted her over his shoulder and made his way back to shore, the current trying to push them both downstream. On dry land, he set her down gently and stepped back, giving her space. She coughed violently, expelling river water, then drew ragged breaths. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice hoarse. "You're welcome," Solomon replied, keeping his distance. "Name's Solomon Reed." She hesitated, eyes calculating even in her weakened state. "Elizabeth Parker," she finally said. The name hit Solomon like a physical blow. Elizabeth Quick-Draw Lizzie Parker, the Lady Gunslinger of Tucson. 3 men dead in duels, 2 stagecoach robberies to her name if the wanted posters were to be believed. Some said she was deadlier than most men with that pearl-handled Colt she carried. Solomon's eyes darted to her hip. No gun belt. Whoever had left her to drown had taken her weapon. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've heard the name," Solomon admitted. She laughed bitterly, wincing at the pain it caused. "Then you should have let me drown. Would have saved yourself a heap of trouble." "Not my place to decide who lives or dies," Solomon said simply. "Now you need medical attention. My ranch is closest." Elizabeth Parker regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Why would you help me? You know what I am." "I know what they say you are," Solomon corrected. "Just like I know what they say about me. Folks round here don't much care for the truth when the lie is more convenient." For a moment, something like understanding passed between them. Then Elizabeth tried to stand and promptly collapsed. Solomon caught her before she hit the ground. "You've got no horse, no gun, and from the looks of it, 3 broken ribs. You can barely stand, let alone make it to the next town. So you can come with me and get patched up, or you can stay here and wait for whoever tied you to that log to come back and finish the job." Elizabeth Parker, the most feared woman in the Arizona Territory, looked up at the black rancher who'd just saved her life and nodded once. Solomon Reed had no way of knowing it then, but that simple act of mercy would soon make him a target for the most dangerous men in the territory and forge a legend that would echo through the canyons of the West for generations to come. Elizabeth Parker woke with a start, hand automatically reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Panic gripped her until the events of the previous day came flooding back: the ambush, the beating, the river, and the black rancher, who had no business saving someone like her. She was in a simple but clean bedroom. Her wet clothes had been replaced with a man's shirt and trousers, both several sizes too large and cinched with rope at the waist. Her ribs were tightly wrapped with bandages, limiting her movement but easing the stabbing pain she'd felt earlier. The door opened, and Solomon Reed entered, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl and a cup of coffee. He set it down on a small table beside the bed. "Figured you'd be hungry," he said, maintaining a respectful distance. Elizabeth eyed the food warily. Solomon almost smiled. "If I wanted you dead, I'd have left you in that river." She reached for the bowl, some kind of stew, and began eating ravenously. She couldn't remember when she'd last had a meal. "Who did this to you?" Solomon asked when she'd finished. Elizabeth's face hardened. "Marshal Caldwell and his men ambushed me outside of Phoenix." Solomon frowned. "The territorial marshal? Why would he leave you to drown instead of bringing you in?" "Because Caldwell's not interested in justice," she spat. "He works for Harrison Blake." The name hung in the air between them. Harrison Blake, the richest man in the Arizona Territory, cattle baron, mine owner, and railroad investor with enough money to buy whatever and whoever he wanted. "What's your quarrel with Blake?" Solomon asked. Elizabeth looked away. "That's my business." Solomon nodded, not pushing. "Rest, we'll figure out what to do when you're stronger." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth spoke again. "They'll come looking for me. When they do, they'll kill anyone who helped me." She fixed him with a steady gaze. "Including you." "Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried," Solomon replied evenly. "Get some sleep, Miss Parker." 2 days passed with Elizabeth growing stronger. Solomon learned she was handy with needle and thread, patching tears in his work shirts while she recovered. She spoke little about herself, but listened intently when Solomon talked about his ranch, how he'd built it from nothing, how the neighboring white ranchers had initially tried to drive him off, how he'd stubbornly held on until they grudgingly accepted his presence, if not his equality. On the 3rd morning, Solomon was mending a fence when he spotted riders approaching, 4 men moving with purpose. He recognized Marshal Caldwell at the lead, his silver badge catching the sunlight. Solomon set down his tools and walked to meet them, positioning himself between the riders and his cabin where Elizabeth was. "Marshal," he said with a nod as the men reined in. Caldwell was a thick-set man with cold eyes and a perpetually sour expression. "Reed," he acknowledged. "We're looking for a fugitive. Dangerous woman, blonde, blue-eyed, goes by the name Elizabeth Parker." "Haven't seen her," Solomon said evenly. One of the deputies, a weasel-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat on the ground. "Mind if we search your property?" "I do mind," Solomon replied. "This is my land, bought and paid for." You got a warrant?" The deputies exchanged looks, hands drifting toward their weapons. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Are you hiding something, Reed?" he asked, voice dangerously soft. "Just protective of my rights," Solomon answered, "same as any man would be." Caldwell studied him for a long moment. "Parker is wanted for murder and robbery. Aiding a fugitive is a hanging offense." "Like I said, I haven't seen her." The marshal's gaze swept over the modest ranch house, the corral with its half-dozen horses, the fields Solomon had coaxed into fertility through years of back-breaking labor. "Nice place you've built here," Caldwell said, the threat implicit in his tone. "Be ashamed to see it burn." Solomon's expression didn't change, but his hand inched closer to the revolver at his hip. "Is that an official statement from a territorial marshal?" A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Caldwell turned his horse. "We'll be watching this place, Reed," he called over his shoulder as they rode away. "Parker can't have gone far. When we find her, and we will, anyone who helped her will swing alongside her." Solomon watched until they disappeared over the ridge before returning to the cabin. Inside, he found Elizabeth dressed in her now dried clothes, her face pale but determined. "I heard," she said. "I need to leave." "Where will you go?" Solomon asked. "Without a horse or a gun, you won't make it 10 miles before they catch you." Elizabeth's shoulders slumped slightly. "I can't stay here. You heard what Caldwell said." "I've been hearing men like Caldwell make threats my whole life," Solomon replied. "But you're right about one thing, you can't stay here." He walked to a trunk at the foot of his bed and unlocked it, pulling out a wrapped bundle. Inside was a Winchester rifle and a belt with 2 holstered revolvers. "These belong to my brother," Solomon explained. "He didn't survive the war." Elizabeth's eyes widened as Solomon handed her one of the revolvers. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." "You don't owe me anything." Solomon was quiet for a long moment. "When I claimed this land, 3 men rode up one night, said no black man had the right to own good grazing land. They beat me until I couldn't stand, then dragged me behind their horses for nearly a mile." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a twisted scar that ran from wrist to elbow. "A Navajo woman found me, half dead. She had every reason to leave a bleeding white man's problem in the dirt. Instead, she took me to her people. They healed me, gave me shelter." Solomon looked Elizabeth in the eye. "Sometimes doing right doesn't need a reason beyond it being right." Elizabeth looked down at the revolver in her hand, then back at Solomon. "Caldwell won't stop coming. Neither will Blake's men." "I know," Solomon said. "That's why we're going to find out why Blake wants you dead so badly." "We?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "You said it yourself. They already believe I helped you. Running now won't change that." For the first time since he'd pulled her from the river, Elizabeth Parker smiled. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges that life had carved into it. "Mr. Reed," she said, checking the revolver's action with practiced ease, "I believe you're about to become part of a legend." What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, Harrison Blake was offering a $1,000 bounty for Elizabeth Parker, dead or alive, and $500 for the Black Rancher reportedly harboring her. You're watching The Black Rancher, where we uncover the erased heroes of the American frontier. If you're enjoying this true story of courage against overwhelming odds, hit that like button now. It helps more people discover these forgotten legends. The town of Copper Springs was barely more than a wide spot in the road. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of weathered buildings clustered around a dusty main street. It was the kind of place most travelers passed through without stopping, which made it perfect for Solomon and Elizabeth's purposes. They arrived at dusk, when the fading light cast long shadows and made faces harder to distinguish. Solomon had given Elizabeth one of his hats, pulled low over her distinctive blonde hair. From a distance, she might pass for a young man riding beside him. They stabled their horses behind the saloon, paying the stable hand extra to keep quiet about their arrival. Inside the saloon, Solomon took a table in the corner with his back to the wall, while Elizabeth approached the bar. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a magnificent mustache, barely glanced at her as he set down a whiskey. "Haven't seen you before," he commented. "Just passing through," Elizabeth replied, pitching her voice lower. "Looking for work, maybe?" The barkeep snorted. Only work around here is in Blake's mines, and trust me, you don't want that kind of work. Blake, Elizabeth said casually. That would be Harrison Blake. Heard he owns half the territory. More than half, the barkeep corrected, warming to the topic. Got the mines, the railroad spur, most of the grazing land north of here. Man's building himself an empire. Must be well liked to be so successful, Elizabeth prompted. The barkeep looked around furtively before leaning closer. Feared is more like it. Blake don't take kindly to competition. Last year, a family tried starting up a small mine on their property. Week later, their shaft collapsed. Both parents killed, leaving 3 young'uns orphaned. He shook his head. Strange thing was, that family had been mining for generations. Knew their business. Ain't no way that shaft collapsed by accident. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully, took her drink, and joined Solomon at his table. Sounds like Blake has quite a reputation, Solomon murmured. And the means to eliminate anyone who stands in his way, Elizabeth added. A commotion at the door drew their attention. A group of rough-looking men entered, trail dust coating their clothes. Mercenaries by the look of them, guns prominently displayed, eyes constantly scanning the room. Elizabeth tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward her hidden revolver. Easy, Solomon whispered. They're not looking for us yet. The men took a table, ordering whiskey and food. Their leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, spoke in low tones, but in the relative quiet of the small saloon, fragments of conversation drifted to where Solomon and Elizabeth sat. Double the usual rate. Blake wants it done by... Woman's dangerous and shot Jenkins between the eyes before he could even... Black rancher helping her. Extra 500. Elizabeth and Solomon exchanged glances. The bounty hunters were discussing them. Time to go, Solomon muttered, laying coins on the table to pay for their untouched drinks. They had almost reached the door when a newcomer burst in, his expression excited. They found 'em, he announced to the room at large. Parker and that black fella who's helping her. They're holed up in a ranch about 20 miles east of here. The scarred bounty hunter was on his feet immediately. You sure? Marshal Caldwell himself confirmed it, the man said proudly. They're gathering a posse now. Blake's offering an extra 200 to anyone who joins. The saloon erupted in activity as men downed their drinks and grabbed their hats, eager to join the hunt. In the confusion, Solomon and Elizabeth slipped out unnoticed. They're going to your ranch, Elizabeth said as they retrieved their horses. Let them, Solomon replied grimly. They won't find anything but empty buildings. We need to leave the territory, Elizabeth insisted. Head for Colorado, maybe, or California. Solomon shook his head. Running won't solve this. Blake will just send men after us. We need to understand why he wants you dead so badly. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her face half hidden in shadow. I know why, she finally admitted. I have proof of what he did. Solomon waited patiently as she reached into her boot and withdrew a folded document, creased and water-stained, but still legible. This is a deed, she explained, handing it to him, to the largest silver mine in the territory. Blake claims he bought it from the original owner, Jacob Parker. Parker? Solomon looked at her sharply. Any relation? My father, Elizabeth confirmed. He discovered that silver vein in '73, built the mine with his own hands. We were going to be rich. Her expression hardened. Then Blake showed up with an offer to buy. My father refused. A week later, he was found dead at the bottom of his own mine shaft. Accident, they called it. Solomon studied the deed. This proves the mine still belonged to your father when he died. Elizabeth nodded. And with him dead, it passed to me, his only child. But Blake produced a bill of sale, claimed my father had changed his mind and sold the mine the day before he died. Everyone believed him. He's Harrison Blake, after all. And when you tried to dispute it, I became a wanted woman, Elizabeth finished bitterly. Amazing how many crimes a person can be accused of when the accuser owns the marshals. Solomon carefully refolded the deed. This is why Blake wants you dead. This deed proves he's a murderer and a thief. One piece of paper against the most powerful man in the territory. Elizabeth laughed without humor. Who would believe us? Judge Monroe would, Solomon said thoughtfully. Federal judge out of Tucson. Known for being incorruptible. Even Blake can't touch a federal judge without bringing Washington down on his head. Hope flickered briefly in Elizabeth's eyes before doubt extinguished it. Tucson is 3 days' ride across open country. Blake's men will be watching every road, every trail. Then we don't use the roads, Solomon replied. I know these lands. There are paths only the Navajo know, passages through the mountains where Blake's men would never think to look. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the decision before them hanging in the air. Why risk your life for this? Elizabeth finally asked. This isn't your fight. Solomon looked out at the darkening landscape, at the territory he'd come to call home despite everything. When men like Blake decide they can take whatever they want, kill whoever stands in their way, it becomes everyone's fight, he said quietly. My people know something about having everything stolen from them. About being told they have no rights anyone is bound to respect. He turned back to Elizabeth, determination hardening his features. Sometimes justice needs a helping hand. Elizabeth Parker, the notorious Lady Gunslinger, studied the face of the black rancher who'd already risked everything to save her once. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition, an understanding deeper than words. To Tucson, then, she said, mounting her horse. And God help anyone who gets in our way. As they rode into the gathering darkness, neither could have imagined the blood-soaked path that lay ahead, nor the legend that would grow from their journey to justice. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the jagged peaks in hues of gold and crimson. Solomon and Elizabeth had ridden through the night, following game trails and ancient paths that wound through the rugged terrain. They were a day ahead of their pursuers, but the hardest part of their journey was still to come. There's a canyon ahead, Solomon explained as they watered their horses at a small spring. The Apaches call it the Devil's Backbone. It cuts through the mountains, a shortcut to Tucson that will save us nearly a day's ride. Elizabeth studied the forbidding landscape. Why wouldn't Blake's men use the same route? Because most folks believe it's impassable, Solomon replied. The entrance is hidden and the path is treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse in some places, with sheer drops on either side. How do you know about it? Solomon's expression softened slightly. After those men dragged me half to death, the Navajo woman who found me, Nijoni, she taught me many things about surviving in this land. Her people have traded with the Apaches for generations. She showed me paths that most white men will never know exist. They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly difficult. By midday, they reached what appeared to be a solid rock face, unremarkable except for a narrow fissure partially hidden behind scrub brush. Solomon dismounted and led his horse toward the opening. We go on foot from here, at least until the canyon widens. The passage was claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on either side. In places, they had to remove their saddlebags and push the reluctant horses through sideways. The ground rose steadily, bringing them higher into the mountains, until suddenly the passage opened into a breathtaking canyon. Walls of striated red rock soared hundreds of feet above them. A small stream trickled along the canyon floor, lined with cottonwoods and mesquite. The path forward hugged the canyon wall, sometimes widening to several feet, other times narrowing to a precarious ledge. We'll rest here, Solomon decided, indicating a small clearing beneath an overhang. The horses need it, and so do we. As Elizabeth gathered wood for a small fire, Solomon checked their supplies. They had food for 2 more days, ammunition for their weapons, and water canteens that needed refilling. Blake's men will have reached your ranch by now, Elizabeth said as they sat beside the fire eating jerky and hardtack. Found it abandoned. Solomon nodded. And they'll be combing the territory for us. But they'll be looking along the main trails to Tucson, not up here in the mountains. What happens when we reach Judge Monroe? Elizabeth asked. Even with the deed, it's our word against Blake's. Monroe is known for his fairness, Solomon replied. And he's no friend to men like Blake who think their money puts them above the law. Elizabeth stared into the fire, her expression distant. My father believed in the law too, thought his deed and his claim would protect him. She looked up at Solomon, her eyes reflecting the flames. It didn't save him. The law isn't perfect, Solomon acknowledged. God knows it's failed my people more times than I can count, but sometimes it's all we have. They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the shadows lengthened across the canyon floor. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the stillness. Solomon reacted instantly, tackling Elizabeth to the ground as a bullet splintered the rock where she'd been sitting. "How?" she gasped. "No time," Solomon cut her off, drawing his revolver. "Get to the horses." More shots rang out, echoing confusingly off the canyon walls. Solomon fired back, aiming at muzzle flashes on the ridge above them. Elizabeth reached the horses, untying them quickly. "Solomon!" she called urgently. He backed toward her, still returning fire. "Get on and ride," he shouted. "Follow the canyon. It leads to Tucson." "Not without you," she insisted, drawing her own weapon and providing covering fire. Solomon swung into his saddle, and they galloped down the canyon, bullets kicking up dust around them. The path narrowed dangerously, forcing them to slow to a precarious walk, still under fire from above. "There," Elizabeth pointed ahead. The canyon widened into a bowl-like area with several diverging passages. "Which way?" Before Solomon could answer, riders appeared at the mouth of one passage, 3 men, guns drawn. "That way." Solomon pointed to a different opening, barely visible behind a stand of scrub pine. They spurred their horses forward as bullets whined past them. Elizabeth returned fire, emptying her revolver at their pursuers. One man fell from his saddle with a cry. The new passage was steeper, climbing rapidly. Their horses labored, footing uncertain on the rocky ground. Behind them, shouts and the thunder of hooves announced their pursuers were gaining. The path turned sharply, then opened onto a plateau overlooking the canyon below. Solomon reined in abruptly. Ahead of them, the trail ended at a sheer drop, at least 60 feet to the canyon floor below. "We're trapped," Elizabeth realized, dismounting to reload her weapon. Solomon surveyed their position. The plateau offered some cover, boulders and scrub they could use for protection. But they were outnumbered, and eventually their ammunition would run out. "How many did you count?" he asked, checking his own weapon. "At least 5, maybe more," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite their dire situation. Solomon's eyes narrowed as he studied the approaching riders. "That's Caldwell in the lead, and the man with the scar. He's the bounty hunter from the saloon." Elizabeth took position behind a boulder, sighting down her revolver. "Quite a reception committee Blake sent for us." Solomon crouched beside her. "You could still make it. Take my horse, double back through that side passage we passed. I can hold them off long enough for you to get away." Elizabeth looked at him incredulously. "And leave you to die? After everything you've done?" She shook her head firmly. "We finished this together, Solomon Reed." The first riders rounded the bend, and gunfire erupted from both sides. Solomon and Elizabeth had the advantage of higher ground and cover, but the attackers had numbers. A bullet grazed Solomon's arm, tearing his sleeve and drawing blood. He barely noticed, calmly returning fire. Beside him, Elizabeth proved her reputation was well earned. 2 more attackers fell to her deadly accuracy, but their situation was deteriorating rapidly. More men joined the assault, spreading out to flank them. Solomon was down to his last few bullets, and Elizabeth's supply wasn't much better. "Solomon," Elizabeth said quietly during a lull in the firing, "the deed, take it." She pressed the water-stained document into his hand. "If one of us is going to make it to Judge Monroe, it should be you." Solomon started to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He tucked the deed securely inside his shirt. "On my signal," Elizabeth continued, "I'm going to draw their fire. You get to the horses and go." "I won't leave you," Solomon insisted. "You have to," Elizabeth replied fiercely. "This isn't about me anymore, or even my father. It's about stopping Blake before he destroys anyone else who stands in his way." Her eyes softened momentarily, including a stubborn black rancher who saved the wrong woman from a river. Before Solomon could respond, Marshal Caldwell's voice boomed across the plateau. "Parker, Reed, throw out your weapons. There's no escape." Elizabeth and Solomon exchanged looks. "I count 6 of them left," Elizabeth whispered. "I'll take the 3 on the right." Solomon nodded grimly. "I've got the left." Together they rose and fired in a coordinated assault that caught their attackers by surprise. 2 more men fell, but return fire forced them back into cover. A bullet struck the rock near Elizabeth's head, sending stone fragments flying. One cut her cheek, drawing blood that ran down her face like tears. "Elizabeth," Solomon began. She turned to him, and in that moment something passed between them, unspoken but profound. In another time, another world perhaps. A fusillade of bullets interrupted the moment, forcing them deeper into cover. "They're closing in," Solomon observed tensely. Elizabeth checked her revolver. 2 bullets left. "Then we make them count." As they prepared for what might be their final stand, a new sound reached them. War cries, fierce and piercing, followed by a volley of arrows raining down on their attackers. Solomon's face broke into a grin of disbelief. "Nijoni," he breathed. A dozen Apache warriors swept down from the ridges above, catching Caldwell's men in a deadly crossfire. The marshal and his remaining men retreated in panic, several falling to Apache arrows before they could escape. When the dust settled, a woman approached Solomon and Elizabeth's position, middle-aged with a weathered face and eyes that held both wisdom and steel. She wore traditional Navajo clothing, but carried a Winchester rifle with practiced ease. "Nijoni," Solomon greeted her with evident relief. The woman nodded. "I heard gunshots. These mountains carry sound far." Her eyes moved to Elizabeth, assessing. "This is the one they hunt?" "Yes," Solomon confirmed. "She has proof of Blake's crimes. We're taking it to the federal judge in Tucson." Nijoni considered this, then nodded decisively. "My people will guide you. There are paths even Blake's dogs cannot find." As Apache warriors secured the plateau and gathered the weapons of the fallen, Elizabeth turned to Solomon. "You have powerful friends," she observed quietly. Solomon watched as Nijoni organized their escort. In this land, true friendship is the most powerful force there is. The Lady Gunslinger studied the black rancher's profile, outlined against the setting sun. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said softly. The federal courthouse in Tucson stood as a symbol of order amidst the frontier chaos, a 2-story brick building with white columns flanking the entrance. After 6 days of hard riding through Apache territory, guided by Nijoni's people along hidden trails, Solomon and Elizabeth arrived dust-covered and exhausted, but alive. A small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, buzzing with excitement. News traveled fast in the territory, and rumors of a confrontation between Harrison Blake's men and a band of Apaches had reached Tucson days before. Solomon and Elizabeth exchanged concerned glances as they approached. Had Blake somehow gotten to Judge Monroe first? They dismounted, tying their horses to a hitching post. Elizabeth adjusted her hat lower over her face. She was still a wanted woman, after all. Inside, the courthouse was bustling with activity. Solomon approached a clerk, requesting an immediate audience with Judge Monroe on a matter of urgent territorial justice. The clerk looked skeptical until Solomon mentioned Harrison Blake's name, at which point his expression shifted to one of keen interest. "Wait here," he instructed, disappearing through a door behind his desk. Minutes later, they were ushered into Judge Monroe's chambers, a spacious room lined with law books, dominated by a massive oak desk. Judge Thaddeus Monroe was in his 60s, with thinning white hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to look straight through pretense. He stood as they entered, studying them with undisguised curiosity. "I'm told you have information regarding Harrison Blake," he said without preamble. Solomon nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. But first, I must ask for your assurance that Ms. Parker will not be arrested before you hear our full testimony." The judge's eyebrows rose as he turned his attention to Elizabeth. "Elizabeth Parker, the woman wanted for stagecoach robbery and murder?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "The woman falsely accused of those crimes by a man who murdered my father and stole his silver mine, Your Honor." Monroe settled back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's a serious accusation against one of the territory's most prominent citizens." "We have proof," Solomon said, withdrawing the water-stained deed from his shirt and placing it on the judge's desk. For the next hour, They laid out the whole story: Jacob Parker's discovery of silver, Blake's attempt to buy the mine, the suspicious accident that claimed his life, and Blake's fraudulent claim of ownership. Elizabeth explained how she'd been framed for crimes she didn't commit when she tried to contest Blake's ownership, and Solomon described finding her bound and drowning in the Gila River. Judge Monroe listened without interruption, occasionally examining the deed, his expression growing grimmer as their tale unfolded. "This document appears authentic," he finally said, "but Blake's bill of sale will also appear legitimate. He would have ensured that." "There's more, Your Honor," Elizabeth said. "My father kept a journal. He recorded every development at the mine, including Blake's offer and his refusal to sell. The journal was in our cabin when Blake's men came for me." "Convenient that this journal is unavailable," Monroe observed. "Not unavailable, Your Honor," came a voice from the doorway. They turned to see Nijoni standing there, holding a leather-bound book. Behind her stood several Apache warriors and a contingent of U.S. Army soldiers led by a captain in a dusty blue uniform. "We found this when we searched Blake's office at the mine," Nijoni explained, approaching the desk and placing the journal beside the deed. "He kept it as a trophy." Judge Monroe opened the journal, skimming the final entries. His face hardened as he read Jacob Parker's last written words, dated the day before his accident, explicitly stating his refusal to sell to Blake under any circumstances. "Captain Reynolds," Monroe addressed the Army officer. "You've reviewed this evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," the captain confirmed. "We also found financial records showing payments to Marshal Caldwell far exceeding his official salary and correspondence regarding the elimination of problems, including specific mention of Elizabeth Parker and a Negro rancher who was helping her." Monroe's decision came swiftly. He issued warrants for Harrison Blake's arrest on charges of murder, fraud, and corruption. He dismissed all charges against Elizabeth Parker and ordered an investigation into Marshal Caldwell and his deputies. "Justice moves slowly sometimes," the judge told Elizabeth and Solomon, "but it does move." 3 weeks later, Harrison Blake stood trial in the same courthouse. The evidence was overwhelming. Former employees testified about his orders to sabotage Jacob Parker's mine. Financial records revealed his systematic corruption of territorial officials. One of his own men, hoping for leniency, confessed to helping dispose of Jacob Parker's body. Blake was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. The silver mine was returned to its rightful owner, Elizabeth Parker. On the courthouse steps after the verdict, Elizabeth turned to Solomon. "I owe you my life," she said simply. Solomon shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Each of us did what we believed was right." Elizabeth glanced toward the mountains where the Seven Arrows Ranch lay. "Your home. Will you rebuild?" "It's still there," Solomon said with a small smile. "Blake's men searched it, but Nijoni's people drove them off before they could burn it. The land endures." An awkward silence fell between them. Their journey together was ending, both knowing it, but neither wanting to say the words. "The mine will need managing," Elizabeth finally said. "I know nothing about mining operations, but I learn quickly." "You'll do fine," Solomon assured her. "I'd do better with a partner," Elizabeth said, meeting his eyes directly. "Someone who understands hard work and perseverance. Someone who knows the value of justice." Solomon's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. "Mining's not so different from ranching, I suppose. Both require faith in what you can't see." "Is that a yes, mister?" "Reed?" Elizabeth asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Solomon looked out at the town, at the territory that had tried to break them both and failed. "It's a maybe, Ms. Parker. But in my experience, maybe is where all the best stories begin." 3 months later, the first shipment of silver left the Parker Reed mine, its profits funding schools for children of all races across the territory. Solomon Reed and Elizabeth Parker became known for their fairness to workers and their unflinching stand against corruption. And when young men and women gathered around campfires throughout the West, they told the legend of the Black Rancher and the Lady Gunslinger, two outcasts who had saved each other and in doing so, changed the Arizona territory forever. Some stories said they became business partners, others claimed they became more. But all agreed on one thing: In a land where justice often came from the barrel of a gun, they found a different way, proving that courage knows no color and that legends are born when good people refuse to look away from wrong. If this story moved you, if you believe these forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, then help me spread their truth. Hit that subscribe button now and become part of the Black Rancher family. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that courage comes in every color and that our real history is far more diverse than we've been taught. Leave a comment below telling me which part of Solomon and Elizabeth's journey touched you most, and what other untold stories from America's past you'd like to see featured on this channel. Thank you for riding alongside these extraordinary heroes today. Until our next journey through the hidden corners of history, this is the Black Rancher, bringing light to the shadows of our shared past.